Hello everybody and welcome back to Biber Hunter Scale Models. This video is about weathering my Panzer IV and how I finished it with rust tones, earth and mud and more. So, if this might be interesting to you, please stay tuned. This is the state of the model after the last video about spraying the camouflage, painting details and chipping. Before I could start the weathering process, I had to disassemble the model for better handling and I placed it on my model jig from Stoffel's Panzerkeller. I always build my models in a way I can remove as much parts as possible, and after removing all the loose parts and placing them on something, I was good to go. I started with sealing the model with matte varnish, so the paint job is protected from the different types of thinner I used in the next steps. The best matte varnish in my eyes is one from Bergswerk, so I gave all parts a good saturated layer with this stuff. The reason why I'm using matte varnish instead of glossy or satin ones is that I now don't have to spray matte varnish after the pin wash, what often knocks down the contrast and turns down the effect. Of course, blending and removing the excess will be harder, but not impossible. With the model now sealed and protected, it was time to start the pin wash. As always, I started on the wheels, because most of them will get covered by mud and earth anyway, and therefore they are the perfect training ground to get back into the technique and get a feeling for the used mediums. With the wheels done, I started to pin wash the model itself. Pin washing is maybe the most boring technique to me, especially on models with that much details, edges and crevices like this Panzer IV. But on the other hand, there is no way of skipping this step, as it's the most essential for me to bring the look of the model from toy-like to more realistic by emphasizing all details with this dark outline. Because the surface was pretty rough after the matte varnish, I didn't give the wash too much time to bite into the surface and began blending almost immediately after applying it. The Modelers World washes are the best in my opinion, because even on these rough surfaces they flew pretty well. And the dedicated thinner is strong enough to remove the excess. The only downside is that it has a stronger smell compared to the usual enamels and thinners. This is the good stuff from Poland, and you have to be aware that you will smell this stuff in your hobby room, and I always open a window when using it. But it's more important to me that the product is working, and this is the case here. And it's not like I am using this stuff for 8 hours a day. As I took the time to add the rivets for the triangles in the building phase, it would be a shame to not emphasize them. So it was a no-brainer to treat them with the wash too, and this was actually a nice moment to see them come to life here and pop out of the yellow surface. Next I grabbed me some lighter washes for depths and fake shadows. I applied the lightest earthy grime over the whole fender where the checker plate pattern was present, and with that added some depth to them because this emphasized the deeper spots. The darker industrial dirt was applied into more hidden areas and corners to make them look darker and add some fake shadows. Thankfully the messy and unpleasant jobs were done for now and I could grab me some acrylic paints. I used slightly lighter versions of the base coat and with that highlighted details like bolts, rivets and other small but raised parts. These got toned down drastically by the dark pin wash, and by highlighting them with this bright paint, they got revived and jumped back into the viewer's eyes. This part is as important to me as the pin wash itself and makes 50% of this step. After the pin wash, my motivation and satisfaction with this model was at 0 because the overall look was dark and dirty. But this step gave my motivation a boost, seeing all these details come back to life, and the model looked way sharper and crispier than before. And also looked a bit more metal and realistic, at least to me. So, after working my way around the model with a brighter yellow paint, I repeated this step with a brighter green and a brighter red-brown paint as well. And when looking at the treated sections afterwards, I was more than happy that I fought myself through these steps. And with my motivation at maximum level, I went to the next step, rust tones. For the rust tones, I used the darker rust streaks and the lighter rust washes. As in the meantime, I am not a fan of these rust bucket tanks anymore. I used the rust enamels very sparingly and not on the vehicle itself. I just don't think that this thick casted steel would rust that fast. So I applied the rust tones only onto the cheaper metal parts, so to say. And the darker rust streaks were only applied on parts like the jack or the jerry cans or the Rommelkiste. After the enamels had a few minutes to dry to the touch, I went back with a thinner moistened brush and blended them into the model's surface. After the dark rust tones had some time to dry, I started to add the light rust tones. And these were not only applied onto the jack or jerry cans, but also onto the side skirt holders and fenders. In general, I think that when there could be some rust on combat vehicles, it should be fresher rust because of the lifespan of these tanks wasn't that long. And like I said, only cheaper parts like sheet metal or parts that are more exposed like the side skirt holders need some rust because they were more in danger to hit obstacles and start rusting. I don't know if this makes sense or not, but at least in my eyes it does, and it looks way better than the rusted tanks I made in the past, which looked like they were in combat for 10 plus years. The Rommelkiste and side skirts were also rusted very sparingly because I think these were the parts where some light, fresh rust could be present. And with this way of lighter rusting, I am way more happy with how the model looked, and as another benefit, I am way faster with this step than I was in the past. Although I diluted the light rust enamel with thinner, it dried out in a bright and strong orange tone, too bright and strong for my taste. To knock these bright tones down a bit, I used the dark rust enamel and with that filtered these orange tones down by applying several thin layers of the dark rust tones on top of them. This made these areas less orange and integrated them better into the model's surface. And with the rust tones done now, I could move on to the next chapter, Earth and Mud. To add mud, I used my proven method of mixing Modeler's World pigments with some dried seagrass, and by adding the fixing solution fluid, I created a muddy paste. This paste was then applied by brush onto the lower hull where mud could accumulate. As the solution fluid dries out pretty quick, I therefore worked in small sections. And before the paste had a chance to dry out, I stippled more pigments into it with a dry soft brush. This gave the paste a nice looking earthen texture. To create more volume, I applied pure solution fluid onto the first layer and stippled another round of pigments into it. This not only builds up the mud, it also helps to fix the pigments stronger to the model. To me, this method gives really good looking results and it's also pretty fast. The brushes can be washed out with water easily when the work is done. And by repeating these steps, I worked my way around the lower hull. On parts where I needed to be more precise, like the return rollers, I applied some pure solution fluid and stippled some pigments into it. All other rollers, idler and driving wheels were treated this way by stippling the dry pigments into some pure solution fluid. Because the dried seagrass was almost not visible this time, I added some more onto the dried out mud and after some pushing in place with a dry brush, fixed it into place with another round of solution fluid, what also gave the pigments additional hold. To adapt the rest of the lower hull to the muddy area, I used oil paints and applied dots of it randomly onto the sides. These dots were then blended with a downward swiping motion to create some kind of streaking effect. I here used different shaped thinner moistened brushes. Again, the rough matte surface wasn't helpful, but with some patience I got to where I wanted to. To add more depth to the mud, I used a dark brown enamel product and applied this slightly diluted into the darker areas and around protruding parts, almost like an earthen pin wash. This emphasized these parts and also gave the impression of fresher, still slightly wet mud. With a thinner saturated brush, I then blended the edges smooth, although the thinner did this almost by itself as it helped the enamel to flow and break the hard edges. And as a last step for the mud on the lower hull, I applied the dark brown wash undiluted by speckling. This added some randomness and made the area a bit more interesting. And with a thinner moistened brush I could rework or remove specks that came out too big or not matching. AK Summer Cursed Earth was matching perfectly to dust the rubber parts of the wheels, so I applied it slightly diluted and rolled the wheels over a paper towel to remove the excess. And after the enamel had a few minutes to dry, I used a thinner moistened brush to blend or remove the excess when there was still too much. The tracks were painted and weathered like I did it in this video. I will link you here and in the description. And now it was finally time to bring everything together. As I like it when everything stays where I want it to be, I glued the idler and wheels in place with plastic cement. The only exception was the driving wheel, because I needed it turning when mounting the tracks. Mounting the tracks is always a very fiddly job I don't really like, because I'm always a bit nervous about damaging or breaking stuff. But with some patience I got to the point where I could close the tracks with the last pins, which I then adapted to the rest with some drops of paint. And that's the hull with mud and mounted tracks. Always a big milestone. The model suddenly looks way more tank-like and a lot of loose parts are now fixed to the model and I have more space on the bench. Before I could start to treat the upper hull and turret with dust and dirt, I quickly glued in place the cargo that would be on the vehicle most of the time, so I could treat this stuff too. Accessories like these make vehicles more unique and lived in, and painting these pieces is almost the most fun part for me. With the cargo glued in place, I could grab me some light dusty oil paints. These were applied super strong diluted and in a random pattern onto the horizontal surfaces and worked into the surface with a stippling motion. The oils can dry out pretty strong, so I made sure to better apply several thin layers instead of one too thick, which would cover the previous work and make the model look too dusty. I used a thinner moistened brush to blend the edges. The cargo was also treated as it would be on the vehicle all the time and therefore should be slightly dusty too. On the vertical surfaces I placed slightly thicker oil paint onto the upper areas and used a white brush to pull them downwards, creating streaks like this. This is supposed to imply dust being washed down the sides by rain. I don't know how these kind of brushes are called, but they are great for creating streaks. I saw other guys using them and got me some cheap ones to test them and they really convinced me. After the turret, the process was then repeated on the upper hull, applying by stippling on the horizontal surfaces, creating streaks on the vertical surfaces. Next I used raw sienna oil paint to finish the dusting. This oil paint has a pretty similar color to the mud and earth I created on the lower hull, and by applying this paint in a very thin layer, I optically connected the upper areas to the lower ones. And this paint also turned down the dusty oils I previously applied, blending and integrating them better into the surface. And that's the dusted turret with the streaks on the side armor. My goal was again to not overdo it and keep it subtle, and I think I was successful here. The finishing touches were made with pigments again, and I used dark steel pigments to give the rusted parts like spare tracks and C-hooks a more metal-like look. Polishing the edges with steel pigments gives them a more realistic used look and they suddenly feel way heavier. A pencil or more fancy graphite pen is also helpful here. It adds another kind of shine in a different color. It's hard to describe, but I always use both pigments and a pencil. Edges and parts like the damaged skirt holders also look better when some shine is looking through, so I worked my way around the vehicle, adding some graphite here and there where I thought it would be matching. And soot was added to the exhaust with soot black pigments. With the model itself basically being finished, I could finally mount the skirts, which were weathered just like the model itself. I carefully placed them onto the holders, making sure they sit right. I used more skirts I originally planned, as you can see in the building video, but I thought it would be cool to have at least one side complete with all skirts, so I changed my plan here. This also adds to my goal to build more realistic and not totally beaten up vehicles. To make sure the skirts stay where they were and aren't dangling around, I placed a small drop of thin CA between them and the holders, so I don't have to worry about losing them and paint rubbing off the smooth brass parts, what can happen easily. And that's the hull basically finished and with the mounted skirts. As cool as it looks, I underestimated how drastically it changed the model's shape, as it now looked way wider and flatter. But in general I am happy so far and glad that I mounted almost all of the skirts. Time to get this thing done. When I think about German vehicles in France or Normandy, Foliage Camouflage comes straight into my mind. So I wanted to add some on this tank too. I used these Diorama Presepe products, cut off small parts from the bigger branches and carefully guided these through the skirt holders. I mixed these two colors together, placing dark green branches into the light green ones and vice versa. And I think it's a real upgrade to the model, although it's hiding a lot of the previous work. To knock down the strong contrast between the two colors of the branches, I used two lighter and two darker green paints. I painted individual dark green leaves with light green paints and vice versa. This tied the two types of branches more together, making the foliage look a bit more blended together. Of course, I could have used only one type of branches, but this would have been a bit too monotonous for my taste. The last thing to do was to add the last accessories, and I placed a lot of equipment and personal stuff around the tank, as I want to create a scene where the crew takes a break and tries to make the best out of the time before the next battle. And that's it for today. All's well that ends well is a saying that wraps up this build best to me. There were times when I was so frustrated with this model, I was close to banging it into the trash bin and start a new project. It was just super annoying that all these fragile parts were constantly in the way. I was really longed to do something with more simple shapes like a Sherman or a Panther. But that would be a first time, surrender is not an option, and in the end I am glad and proud that I kept with it and finished it. I also think that it was worth the blood and tears. Not sure if I like it more than my Stuk last year, but it's definitely not my worst model so far. So, let me know what you think about it. I would love to hear your thoughts. And I hope my video was interesting to watch and maybe even helpful, and you could learn a thing or two. If you like what you saw, I would be very happy if you support me by subscribing. Und nein, das gibt es nicht auch auf Deutsch. So, enough said for today. Thanks again for watching. Good luck for your own projects. Stay safe and until the next time.